Book Review: The Gray Lady Winked. The Gray Lady Winked: How the New York Times Misreporting, Distortions, and Fabrications Radically Alter History by Ashley Rinsberg, with a foreword by Mark Crispin Miller. From Midnight Oil Publishers, May 3rd, 2021. First edition, 283 pages. The New York Times is arguably the most influential newspaper in the world. Its uncritical repetition of government and Democratic Party propaganda regarding the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdowns has drawn critical attention to its news reporting as never before in the U.S. history. Ironically, former Times reporter Alex Berenson has become a leading critic of the government's often changing COVID and lockdown claims, as well as the Times' dubious reporting. The Gray Lady Winked attempts to be a comprehensive expose of controversial and clearly inaccurate, even fraudulent news reporting by the paper dating back to its coverage of the Nazis and Stalinist Russia in the early 20th century. Although the New York Times has long been criticized by many, this appears to be the first attempt to cover the controversies and scandals in a single book, an audacious and difficult undertaking given the scope of the New York Times news reporting. The Gray Lady Winked is a short book with 10 chapters, each covering a controversial news story. The Nazis, the Ukraine famine under Stalin, the Times' muted coverage of the Holocaust, despite or perhaps because it was a Jewish newspaper, Herbert Matthews' glowing coverage of Fidel Castro, David Halberstam and Neil Sheehan's questionable reporting from Vietnam, the early cover-up of radiation sickness in Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the U.S. government and the Times working hand in hand, the controversy over the death of Mohammed al-Dura, a 10-year-old Palestinian boy shot during the early days of the Second Intifada in 2000, the Times' questionable and inaccurate reporting after September 11, and on the elusive weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, questionable reporting on an alleged epidemic of violence by veterans of the Second Iraq War and the Afghan War, and finally, the super-controversial 1619 Project, with its dubious claims that the American Revolution was fought to preserve slavery. Each of these chapters covers a complex topic that could be, and in many cases has been, covered by entire lengthy books, some of which are used as references. The Gray Lady Winked skips other scandals and controversies, such as the infamous Kitty Genovese murder Times reporting, which falsely portrayed an entire neighborhood, 38 people, watching a young woman raped and murdered from their apartment windows without calling the police, and the controversies over Raymond Bonner's reporting on El Salvador in the early 1980s. I felt the book's driving agenda and goal is to criticize and discredit the Times reporting on Israel, specifically the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, where the heavily Jewish Times is accused of a pro-Palestinian bias, if not a sinister agenda. In particular, coverage of the death of Mohammed al-Dura and the Second Intifada by then Times Jerusalem bureau chief Deborah Sontag and her husband Walter Orm come in for heavy criticism. Ashley Rinsberg lives in Israel with his family, according to the book, and presumably is an Israeli citizen. To this end, the book collects many historical episodes of questionable or false reporting by the Times to discredit its coverage of Israel. See, they've done it to many others and could do it to you too, dear reader. I found some of the arguments emotional and unconvincing, notably in the chapter The White Taffeta Gown, quote, people who happen to be Jewish, unquote, which covers the Times' muted response to the Holocaust. The phrase white taffeta gown is drawn from glowing Times coverage of the marriage of publisher Arthur Hayes Sulzberger's daughter Marion to Orville Dreyfus on July 8, 1941, even as the Nazis were massacring Jews in Ponary, Poland. The Nazis and the Holocaust are a touchy and emotional topic, especially for Jews. It is usually difficult to challenge arguments that invoke the Holocaust. The chapter argues that anti-Semitism was rife in the U.S. and in heavily Jewish New York City in 1941. Rinsberg seems to blame the Times downplaying the Jewish origin of the Sulzberger family and many, many Times reporters, both on fear of anti-Semitism and on the assimilationist views specific to German Reform or conservative Jews, such as the Sulzberger family. The book seems to argue that the Times should have loudly announced their Jewishness, led the charge to publicize the Holocaust. With no certainty this would save a single life, and no fear of losing the Times' vast influence in the U.S. and the world in the face of alleged pervasive, deep-rooted anti-Semitism in the U.S. There are a number of problems with these arguments. Many Jews, not just German Reform conservative Jews like the Sulzbergers, downplayed or disguised their Jewish origins at the time. Many of these Jews, in Hollywood for example, were Eastern European, Polish, Lithuanian, Latvian, Ukrainian, etc. in origin, and not German. Indeed, the Holocaust did not become a pop culture phenomenon in the U.S. until the 1970s. Although the Nazis were almost always portrayed as monsters, heavily Jewish Hollywood largely steered clear of the Holocaust and specifically Jewish issues in movies and television prior to the 1970s, portraying the Nazis as an insane threat to everyone, which was the U.S. government line during World War II. Outside of big cities such as New York, most Americans had probably never even encountered a Jew, Rinsberg's militant terminology, or, quote, a person who happens to be Jewish, point of view attributed to the Times and the Sulzbergers, the assimilationist language. Might well have thought them to be ancient history or a myth found only in the Bible. It's not clear how most Americans in 1941 would have responded to a loudly, militantly Jewish Hollywood or New York Times. How rife was anti-Semitism in the U.S., let alone heavily Jewish, New York City in 1941? One of the remarkable aspects of the 1920s and 30s was how many Jews, either immigrants or the children of immigrants, mostly from Eastern Europe, were somehow admitted to the top Ivy League universities such as Harvard, Yale, and Princeton during this period. The Jewish Virtual Library, for example, claims that 22% of Harvard's 1922 freshman class were Jewish. This heavy representation of the tiny U.S. Jewish minority predates the reforms that created the SAT, Scholastic Aptitude Tests, to recruit mostly middle-class students from across the country and more diverse backgrounds than had previously been the case at Harvard and other Ivy League schools. Readers may have heard of the quotas to limit the fraction of Jews in Ivy League schools at the time, but as with the 15 to 20% Asian quotas practiced by these schools today, these quotas were much larger than the percent of Jews in the general U.S. population then or now. Jewish sources usually credit the unusually high representation of Jews, a tiny minority, in Ivy League colleges such as Harvard during the 1920s and after to, quote, merit, unquote. But the Ivy League schools at this time were far from the modern concept of competitive higher education. They derived most of their students, with the apparent exception of Jews, from elite prep schools, often modeled on the English, quote, public schools, unquote, such as Eton and Harrow, that prepared students for Oxford and Cambridge and the top positions in the British Empire. This was the heyday of Anglo-American WASP elitism. This meant the entire graduating class from elite prep schools such as Phillips Exeter, Phillips Andover, which is the alma mater of both George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush, Groton, which is Franklin Delano Roosevelt's alma mater, and others, would go to one of the Ivy League schools. These were nearly all the children of wealthy, often politically connected white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Other groups, such as Irish Catholics, had great difficulty getting into these top schools. Joseph Kennedy, the president's father, was able to get into Harvard, but this was almost certainly because his father was the boss of the Democratic machine in Boston, and Harvard had to keep the city government happy. One could go on in this vein for some time. Rife with anti-Semitism? The Gray Lady Winked is useful as an attempt, probably the first attempt, to give a comprehensive account of the history of questionable and indeed clearly false reporting in some cases on major, consequential news stories and events by the Times. This is a huge subject, and the chapters are often too short to adequately cover the complexities of the stories. The Jewish inside baseball and pro-Israeli bias detract from some parts of the book. A second edition might address some of these issues. At present, it may be the best treatment, possibly the only treatment, of the New York Times history of errors and controversies. This concludes this video presentation. If you like this video, please click like. Please click subscribe and the notification bell if you would like to receive more content from us. You can avoid internet censorship by subscribing directly to our RSS news feed. Please consider sharing the link by email and on your website or blog, in addition to liking, upvoting, or sharing on increasingly censored, advertising beholden, big company social media. We have encountered such censorship. Mathematical software is developing algorithms and software to automate data analysis, reducing the risks of costly errors and increasing the predictive power of the results. You can support our work financially by subscribing on our Patreon page, https://www.patreon.com/mathsoft, or scanning the QR code in the lower right corner.